Hello. Can you guys see and hear me okay? Great. Good deal. Well, it's so great to see you all here. Thank you for coming. I wanted to take a few minutes to introduce myself if you weren't at my last session. So, my name is Megan Bowman, and I am an AP history teacher in the United States. This is my 14th year of teaching. I've taught in a variety of um, different avenues. I've taught in public schools. I've taught for a homeschool co-op. I currently teach online and I also tutor. So I am super excited to be teaching you all today, especially the topic for today, because I also, when I was in college, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Rome. So I love European history. It's one of the courses that I am currently teaching, and I love teaching in this capacity. I love teaching to students, interestingly enough, who I've never met before, because I think it's just really fun to be able to interact with you all. Um, it's kind of a nice break from my normal classroom because I'm trying to prepare my students. So I teach 3 sections of AP history, and I like to teach. I love those classes, but this is kind of a stress-free way to teach because you guys don't have to take my tests, and I'm not trying to prepare you for the AP exam in May. So it's kind of nice. It's a lot more fun in that respect. So today we are going to be talking about an interesting time in history, and I want to share with you. Let me pull this up. So I am going to be talking specifically about the period of European history from, let me pull this up, excuse me, from roughly technically it's 1250 to 1350, but we'll be covering quite a lot in this period here. So let me get this going so that you guys can see my PowerPoint. Okay, can you all, let me open up the chat so I can see you guys. One moment here. There's the chat. Okay. All right, so can you guys see the PowerPoint? Great, good deal. Okay, so we're going to be talking about, like I said, the medieval world from 1250 to 1350, and let's go ahead and dive in. So the late Middle Ages saw political, social, and ecclesiastical turmoil never seen in European history before. And what I mean by ecclesiastical is dealing with the church, okay? Now, at this time in history, how would you describe the Christian church? Would it be Protestant or Catholic? What do you guys think? Are we looking at a Protestant church in European history at this point, or a Catholic church? Catholic, yes. So Catholic literally just means universal, and the church, the Christian church, had grown obviously since the Roman Empire, since the birth and life and death. And of course, according to Christians, they claim that Jesus had resurrected from the dead and ascended into heaven. And ever since then, his followers carried out what they would call the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And that is kind of the history of how the early church started. Eventually, over the centuries, it grew into what most people know of even today as the Catholic Church. Now, after this period that we're about to talk about, eventually we're going to get to the Protestant Reformation, and that starts in 1517, in the 1500s, and that's going to be kind of the break with the Catholic Church, where we start to see both Catholic churches in Europe, and eventually we see Protestant churches as well. We'll talk about that down the road. But for this time in history, we're really just looking at the Catholic Church, okay? So France and England were engaged in a bitter conflict during this period called the Hundred Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453. It was actually over 100 years. A war of seemingly willful self-destruction. I'm sure you've heard of it. Even if you don't know many details about it, I'm sure you've heard of the Hundred Years' War. And then we'll also talk about the bubonic plague. What was the bubonic plague also called? Anyone know? Since we're living in a time of pandemic, we'll have a little bit of a tie into today. The Black Death. Yeah, the Black Death. This is when the Black Death spread throughout Asia and along trade routes, specifically throughout a lot of the trans-Saharan routes and the maritime trade as well, and ended up in Europe. So we'll talk about the impact it specifically had on Europe. And then also we're going to see a schism that emerged within the Roman Church, which lasted for 39 years. All right. So last class, how many of you, let me see if I can do this. How many of you were here last week? Or I'll do it the opposite. How many of you were not here last time we met? Feel free to just say in the chat pod if this is your first time. Anyone else? A couple people. Okay. All right. Well, this will be good because even for people who were here last time, I'm going to do a quick review of Russia because last time I taught about kind of the early formations of England and France and Spain, and I reviewed briefly, I discussed Russia, but I want to go back to Russia because it's going to be helpful for us to set the context of what we're talking about next. So quick review of Russia. The vast lands, because Russia was huge at this time, served as the border between Europe and the steppes of Afro-Eurasia. And when I say the word steppe, that's how it's spelled. That refers to a large area that's a grassy plain. And oftentimes in the Asian steppe, we see semi-nomadic people who their livelihood wasn't like farming, staying in one place, but they moved around following herds of animals, oftentimes cattle, and that was their livelihood. So we'll talk about those people groups in a little bit here. But anyway, Russia served as kind of the in-between area between Europe and the Afro-Eurasian steppe. There's one city in particular I talked about last time called the city of Kiev, and it emerged as a crossroads that looked southward to Byzantium for all kinds of help, for inspiration in terms of how to set up their government, for inspiration in terms of religion even, and even cultural elements as well. We'll talk about that. To the north and northeast, throughout Russia, we see smaller replicas of the city of Kiev that served as trading outposts. And we're going to see the influence of the Byzantine Greek Orthodox Church on the development of Russia. Okay, can you guys still see and hear me okay? Awesome, great, okay. So the development of the Kievan state. So again, I talked about that city of Kiev. It was located on the Dnieper River, which if you sail south, the Dnieper River eventually ends up in the Black Sea. And if you keep going down south, you'll eventually get to the city of Byzantium, which would eventually be renamed Constantinople by the Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire. This is a quick crash course in how we see the city of Kiev. And then eventually in 1453, which falls just about inside the time period, a little bit outside the time period of this, but eventually the Ottoman Turks are going to conquer Constantinople in 1453 and rename it Istanbul. Maybe you've heard that song on YouTube about the city of Constantinople being renamed Istanbul. I'm not going to sing it because it'll get stuck in your head and then you'll be frustrated with me. At any rate, if you're curious later on, you can search on YouTube Istanbul, Constantinople, and it will get in your head. Anyway, that city, the city of Constantinople, is going to have a huge impact on the city of Kiev, far to the north in Russia. Okay, that's what I was talking about last slide. Anyway, this Kievan state that emerged in Russia can be attributed, a lot of it can be attributed to a man named Oleg of Novgorod. And he was the first historical leader of Kiev. And then his grandson, Snatoslav, temporarily strengthened his father's state. But going back to Oleg of Novgorod, he was responsible for kind of taking all of the surrounding regions and claiming authority over them, okay? And he's going to claim authority over all these different people groups and what we know today as Russia until his death. While he was alive, claiming that authority actually worked. But he failed to codify his laws, codify meaning write his law codes down. And so a lot of the central authority he exercised while he was in power fell apart when he died. His son never achieved that level of power and authority that his father had. Oleg's grandson, however, was better at managing things. He had a stronger sense of how to manage the military and his the state of the Kievan Rus. So he strengthened the Kievan state by finally overcoming Russia's longtime enemies, the Khazars. Once the Khazars were defeated, the eastern borders opened up. However, Kiev was vulnerable to a new enemy, an Asiatic one. Does anyone have a guess as to who will overtake Russia in the coming years? Yes, very good. The Mongols. Very good. And we will get there in just a moment. Yes, the Mongols. I think I have some Mongol people interested in the Mongols, like I am. I love the Mongols. They're incredibly violent and fierce, and that's scary. They were terrifying, I'm sure, but they're also fascinating to me, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. Yeah, exactly, for sure. So let's, real quick, before we talk about the Mongols, I promise we will get there. Kiev possessed strong trade ties, extensive commercial trade routes, agricultural tributes, and merchant tariffs. What do all these things mean? This basically means they were very good at trading with outsiders. They were very detailed in their record keeping. They extracted tributes from other people, meaning people had to pay for the right to trade with them. And they also put taxes on imported goods. That's a tariff. A tariff is a tax on an imported good, on a foreign good. They had their own items that they traded. They traded things like honey, fur, wax, transport boats. Interestingly enough, they built boats, and this all led towards being successful traders. These successful commercial endeavors led to the wide use of coinage over barter. And I think I talked about this last week. Do you guys remember my analogy about the barter system versus using coinage is kind of like trying to trade. If you're in school and you and your friend are trying to trade each other's lunches. Do you remember me talking about this if you were here last time? Anyone remember? Okay, so yeah, I tried to trade my lunch, certain items for my best friend Melanie, who I'm still friends with to this day. This is back in like first grade, and I still am really close with her. But she always had the best lunches. She always had the most delicious foods in her lunch. And I had okay lunches, but sometimes I try to trade like my almonds for her cookies. Okay. And I don't know which of those you'd prefer, but most people would agree, no, that's not a fair trade. You can't trade almonds for cookies, right? It's just not right. It's not going to work. The only way to barter, to trade with someone is if both people agree on the trade, right? And that could work with you and your friend if you have comparable lunches and you agree on what to trade. But pretend for a minute the whole lunchroom, everyone in the cafeteria had to buy their lunch via barter, the barter system. How would that work? Would that work? What do you think? Or would it take too long? I mean, when I was a student in school, we had 30 minutes. We really had 25 minutes to eat. As a teacher, I only have 20 to 25 minutes to eat before I have to go back to class. It probably wouldn't work, right? It would take too long. So as soon as you increase the population and you increase the numbers of people who are interested in buying goods, going to some sort of monetary system is so much more efficient. Why? Why is that better? Okay, yeah. So it basically, you and I can quickly agree on the intrinsic value of money, right? We don't have to argue about it. We know what it's worth and we can agree on it. So, yeah, so you don't want to do that, obviously, but you can see where if the volume of trade is going up, the number of people participating is going up, it makes more sense to do some sort of coinage or monetary system that we can all agree on. Okay. And so that's what they did. Anyway, the Kievan state, this is pretty cool. The Kievan state built many boats for trade purposes. They were boat builders. Okay. But the Russian people, the unfortunate thing is they stripped most of their forests to create these boats. Okay, they had the wood to use, but in knocking down a lot of their forests, it actually took away one of their natural protective boundaries, especially from the east. Okay, how is that going to hurt them? Again, you guys said it a few minutes ago, but how is that going to hurt them in their not too distant future? Who's going to attack them from the east? The Mongols. Yeah, exactly. So that's going to come back to haunt them for sure. But the other issue for them is anytime a merchant boat was attacked, war happened. Immediately it blew up into war. Okay. In those days, only the prince's treasury benefited from trade. The majority of the peasant population relied on subsistence farming. Basically, subsistence farming is you only grow what you need for you and your family to eat. You're not growing enough food to sell and make money. It's just for you and your family to survive. Okay. So all this to say, the Kievan state was growing weaker, which set the stage for the eventual takeover by the Mongols. But before this, another grandson introduced Christianity to the Russian lands, and we do need to talk about this briefly. You guys can still see my slide okay? Yes, okay, good. Just making sure. So in the year 987, Prince Vladimir was shopping around for a state religion in order to provide some cultural and social consolidation for Russia. This happens a lot throughout history where rulers will use a religion to help unite the people in a common, so they'd have a common goal, common beliefs, and normally the ruler did it in such a way so that the ruler would be the head of that religion in a sense, and that would give the ruler kind of both political and almost spiritual authority as well. So Vladimir was courted by many religious leaders of various faiths, including Islam and Christianity. In a meeting with his boyars, this is a term for the Russian nobles, the wealthier men in Russia. So in a meeting with the boyars and the city elders, the prince decided that Christianity was the best state religion. And in this meeting, he decided it because he thought that Christianity would bring his state the most profit. Think again of who's to the south of Russia at this point, the Byzantine Empire, okay? And they are Christian. And I'm sure that potential for trade would be a huge reason for establishing Christianity in Russia, okay? So in 988, Prince Vladimir declared the Eastern Byzantium form of Christianity as the official state religion. This is why even today we see kind of the Greek Orthodox version of Christianity practiced in Russia, not the Roman Catholic version like we see in Europe, okay? Although Christianity gradually gained political power over the centuries in Russian history, ultimately the church was subordinate to the state. So again, just like I said a moment ago, the leader was hoping to be not only the political ruler, but also the spiritual ruler as well and have more power in that way. But the Russian church was able to secure some political power in different periods throughout Russian history. Christianity both enthralled and distracted the princes at first. one man by the name of Yaroslav the Wise loved it so much that he spent time studying all the religious texts he could find and translated them from the Greek to the Slav language, the Slav being the language of the Russians. Because Greek Orthodox Christianity was the official state religion, it meant that Russia's early princes answered to the church leaders in Byzantium and not to the Pope in Rome. So, how many of you have heard of the Great Schism that occurred in the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church? Has anyone ever heard of that? There were actually, can you guys still hear me okay? There were actually two different schisms, but the one I'm talking about is a schism that occurred between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, what ultimately the Byzantine Empire came to believe. And you know, you don't need to know that much about it, but it's important to know that it happened in the 1000s AD. And it was pretty significant because it meant that, again, Western Europe was going to be Roman Catholic, and the Byzantine Empire, which is kind of, if you think of South and Southeast Europe, that region would be Orthodox Christianity. And they're definitely going, you know, once in a while they will band together. Like there was one of the Crusades, they banded together to fight the Muslims. But oftentimes there was great tension between those two churches. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, I wanted to look one thing up that my video, let me see if I can find this real quick. So in the chat pod, can you guys tell me what comes to mind when you think of the Mongols? Type it in the chat pod.
Hi, Megan. Hello, Megan.
Yes. Okay. Can you?
I think you like just close the microphone.
There we go. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, there we go. All right. So far, I haven't heard. Okay, I see mangoes and Genghis. Okay, Genghis Khan. There we go. Death. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I forgot to scroll down. Now I'm seeing your answers. People attacking. Okay. Very cruel. Okay. So that's what you think of when you think of the Mongols. Okay, interesting. Let me see if I can update you a little bit on your Mongol knowledge. Okay. So here we go. Let's talk about them. So can you guys see my PowerPoint slide? Okay. Well, now you guys just probably want to eat mangoes instead of listen about the Mongols. But let's talk about the Mongols. Okay, so after the Kievan state in Russia, the Mongol Empire expanded dramatically. The Mongols were a nomadic people of the Central Asian steppes. Now remember, the steppes were those grassy plains. So they're semi-nomadic. They move around periodically. They follow their cattle and their herds, okay? They were really, really great horsemen and herdsmen. Their most famous leader was a man by the name of Temujin. Temujin later became known as Genghis Khan. Okay, no one said Temujin in the chat pod, so I thought that I thought someone might be able to come up with that name, but no one did. That's all right. So Genghis Khan's accomplishments included the unification of various Mongol tribes, building a huge military force, and he was the grandfather of Kublai Khan, who conquered China, and he's going to be the one to kind of head up the Yuan dynasty in China. All right. Genghis Khan fathered and grandfathered many others, but we won't get into that. But crucial commercial cities and trading posts are going to be incorporated during Genghis Khan's reign. Eventually, the Mongols conquered southern Russia and its capital around 1240. And then the Battle of Liegnitz in 1241 resulted in further westward expansion. Okay. So this image on the bottom right is from a 14th century chronicle and shows heavily armored knights from Poland and Germany at the right, confronting the swift-moving mounted archers of the Mongol cavalry. Mongol warriors often had the advantage over Europeans because their smaller, faster horses carried lighter loads, and because the Mongol warriors themselves could shoot down their opponents at long range. Why is the study of the Mongol invasions important to European history, though? Well, here's the thing. Even though the Mongols were from the East, they had a definite impact on the transformation of Europe. Everyone in Europe knew who Genghis Khan was. In fact, many in Europe believed he was one of the riders of the apocalypse as detailed in the book of Revelation from the Bible, okay? So people were terrified of him, and with good reason, okay? And we'll look at that. But yeah, I love this meme. So basic rules of history: don't invade Russia in the winter or get involved in a land war in Asia unless you're the Mongols. Rules don't apply to the Mongols. Okay, so with that said, I want to share with you briefly my all-time favorite video clip by John Green. I want to see if this is going to work. We're gonna watch this in stages instead of watching it all at one time. We're going to watch it in little tidbits and then we'll come back to it. Okay, I promise. Okay, so the question is, if I do this, I might need to just do it like this so I can continue to see the chat pod. Okay, can you guys at least see the, sorry, I don't want to cover it up. Can you guys see the video screen okay? I know it's smaller, but I want to be able to read the chat pod. Yes, you can see it. Awesome. Okay, here we go. Can you hear it okay? Can you guys hear it?
So remember herders? We talked about them back in episode 1 as an alternative to hunting and gathering or agriculture. Here are the key things to remember. 1, nomads aren't Jack Kerouac. They don't go on like random road trips. They migrate according to climate conditions so they can feed their flocks. 2, nomads don't generally produce manufactured goods, which means they need to trade, so they almost always live near settled people. And 3, because they generally live close to nature and in harsh conditions, pastoralists tend to be tougher than diamond-plated differential calculus. Like think of the Huns or the Xiongnu or the Mongols. Okay, Stan, that's enough. Back to me. Come, Stan, I am the star of the show, not the Mongols! Hi. Sorry about that. Right, so one last thing. Pastoral people also tend to be more egalitarian, especially where women are concerned. Paradoxically, when there's less to go around, humans tend to share more, and when both men and women must work for the social order to survive, there tends to be less patriarchal domination of women, although Mongol women rarely went to war. I can't tell your gender. I mean, you've got the pants, but then you also have the floopity-flop, so... That's the technical term, by the way. I'm a historian. If you had to choose a pastoral nomadic group to come out of Central Asia and dominate the world, you probably wouldn't have chosen the Mongols, because for most of the history we've been discussing, they just hung out in the foothills bordering the Siberian forest, mixing, herding, and hunting, quietly getting really good at archery and riding horses. Also, the Mongols were much smaller than other pastoral groups like the Tatars or the Uyghurs. And not to get like all great man history on you or anything, but the reason the Mongols came to dominate the world really started with one guy, Genghis Khan.
Okay. Before we get to the story of Genghis Khan, I don't want to spoil it with the video before I've had a chance to talk to you about it. So here we go. Back to our share. All right. Can you guys see the PowerPoint again? All right. Don't worry, we will go back to the video. So Genghis Khan was known to his enemies as the rider of the apocalypse. While knights in Europe were highly skilled and prepared for battle, they were completely unprepared for Mongol invasion. The 13th century Mongols fought and conquered, inspired by their leader Genghis Khan. By the time the Mongols reached the eastern edges of Europe, they had already conquered most of Afro-Eurasia. Genghis Khan was named Temujin at birth. According to birth stories, Temujin was born with a blood clot which shamans decided to read and divine. Their divination of this blood clot predicted that Temujin would one day grow to be a great warrior. The Mongols came from the vast Central Asian steppe region. The law of the land, according to the Mongols, was to take what you needed in order to survive. When Temujin was just a child, he was trained in archery and horse riding, much like all good Mongolian boys. He lived in yurts and traveled from place to place, living the nomadic lifestyle of his people. When Temujin was 10 years old, he was betrothed in an arranged marriage, a common Mongol practice. He and his bride-to-be became great friends, and they often rode on horseback side by side, exploring the steppes of their homeland. Shortly after his marriage was arranged, however, Temujin's father was killed by a warring clan, which forced Temujin to leave his new family and return back home to care for his mother and brothers, who were left alone with no protector. To further make things worse, his family's riches were plundered, leaving them in poverty. Their poverty led to increased tensions within the family, which ultimately led to violent conflicts. Temujin and one of his brothers actually conspired to murder their youngest brother. Meanwhile, his father's enemies continued to hunt the family down, keeping them constantly on the move. One day, they were attacked in the woods by their father's enemies. Temujin's mother basically just put him on a horse and sent him into the woods. Like, okay, good luck, survive. He was captured and forced to serve as a slave to his father's enemies. At this point in history, we don't really know what happened to Genghis Khan. His story kind of picks up once he's a grown man, leading an army of thousands of Mongol warriors. After a search for his bride-to-be, I like this part of the story, he eventually finds her and they do get married. During this time, Temujin begins, with permission from the head Khan, to build armies. He offers incentives in order to build loyalty by offering all those who engage in successful raids to keep their spoils. His army becomes the most highly skilled army in weaponry and the crafting of the reflex bow and the scimitar. The European longbow used by knights is no competition against this Mongol weapon. The reflex bow and its technology had the velocity to pierce straight through European chainmail. Innovations in technology and wise leadership earned Temujin the role of Khan, the head of all the tribal chiefs of the Mongol clans. He changed his name to Genghis, and among other Mongolian adventures, he conquered Moscow and the old medieval state of Kiev, the Kievan state I talked about a few slides ago. Okay, let's jump back briefly, just for another moment, to our John Green. Okay, here's the thought bubble. I like the way he portrays the story that I just told. So can you guys see the video again? All right, here we go.
Let's go to the thought bubble. The story goes that Genghis, or Chinggis Khan, was born around 1162 with the name Temujin to a lowly clan. His father was poisoned to death, leaving Temujin under the control of his older brothers, one of whom he soon killed during an argument. By 19, he was married to his first and most important wife, Borte, who was later kidnapped. This was pretty common among the Mongols. Temujin's mom had also been kidnapped. In rescuing his wife, Temujin proved his military mettle, and he soon became a leader of his tribe, but uniting the Mongol confederations required a civil war, which he won, largely thanks to two innovations. First, he promoted people based on merit rather than family position, and second, he brought lower classes of conquered people into his own tribe while dispossessing the leaders of the conquered clans. Thus, he made peasants love him. The rich hated him, but they didn't matter anymore because they were no longer rich. With these two building block policies, Temujin was able to win the loyalty of more and more people, and in 1206 he was declared the Great Khan, the leader of all the Mongols. How? Well, the Mongols chose their rulers in a really cool way. A prospective ruler would call a general council called a kurultai, and anyone who supported his candidacy for leadership would show up on their horses, literally voting with their feet. Mr. Green, but horses don't have feet. They have hooves. I hate you, me from the past. Also, no interrupting the thought bubble. After uniting the Mongols, Genghis Khan went on to conquer a lot of territory. By the time he died in his sleep in 1227, his empire stretched from the Mongol homeland in Mongolia all the way to the Caspian Sea. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So that's a pretty good looking empire, and sure, a lot of it was pasture or mountains or desert, but The Mongols did conquer a lot of people too. And in some ways, with Genghis's death, the empire was just getting started. His son Ogadai Khan expanded the empire even more. And Genghis's grandson Mongke was the great Khan in 1258 when Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Empire, fell to the Mongols. And another of Genghis's grandsons, Kublai Khan, conquered the Sung dynasty in China in 1279. And if the Mamluks hadn't stopped another of Genghis's grandsons at the Battle of Ain Jalut, they probably would have taken all of North Africa. Man, Genghis Khan sure had a lot of grandkids.
All right, we're going to pause there. So you saw on the map, hopefully from the video clip, the extent of the Mongol Empire. There were several. I'm going to just take a moment to run this by you because I don't go into this much depth in my PowerPoint, but I think it's worthwhile to say. There were several big things you need to know about big impacts of the Mongol Empire. So yeah, their empire was bought with a lot of violence and blood. Once they became an empire, they were known for the peace and stability that they brought about under their rule. And interestingly enough, we see trade expanding and doing very well during the rule of the Mongols. In fact, sometimes it's referred to as, have you ever heard of this? The Pax Mongolica, meaning the Mongol peace, which you don't normally put those two words together since they were so incredibly violent when they were conquering much of Eurasia. But while they were in power, one source declared that you could walk from one end of the empire to the other end of the empire with a gold plate on your head and no one would rob you. That's how safe it was for trade and travel. Unfortunately, one of the byproducts of that safe trade and travel is going to ultimately be the spread of the Black Plague. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but let's jump over to just finishing out the Mongols here. So eventually the Mongols controlled caravan routes from the Mediterranean and the Black Sea all the way to China. Trade routes were policed and travelers were safeguarded. Trade between East and West was greatly improved. At this point, Europeans like Marco Polo began to take advantage of the trade routes. But as empires rise and fall, so too conflicts arose, eventually breaking down trade. Conditions changed to the point that the trade network was no longer sustainable, and reestablishing the connection remained a hope for the future. There were several motives for European expansion at this time. We're going to jump back to Europe for a little bit. The desire for African gold, for example, is going to be one of the huge motives for European expansion, and the expansion of European colonial empires in the Western Mediterranean Sea. Before gold, silver was the desired form of currency, but due to silver shortages, the African gold trade reignited. Catalan and Genoese merchants traded wool for gold at Tunis, one of the major trading ports. In fact, gold was becoming so scarce it led to a balance of payments problem. There was too much silver flowing east due to the spice trade. So at this point in history, everyone wanted luxury goods and spices from the Indian Ocean world of trade, okay? Think of like nutmeg and pepper from Indonesia, for example. So once the silver reached China, it was hoarded by the Chinese government and was not re-released into the trade market. This led to the desire for gold as an alternative for large transactions. The desire to colonize came long before the discovery of the New World. As the European desire for gold increased, so too did their expansion efforts. There were 3 main European colonies formed in the Mediterranean in response to expansion, and students rarely know about these 3 colonies: Catalonia, Venice, and Genoa, okay? Catalonia was colonized, and the Catalan settlers used expropriation and extermination in order to complete colonization and attract new settlers. So I don't know if you know these terms, but I'll put them in the chat pod. Expropriation is when a government legally takes private property in order to, so it steals that private property from the person and then takes it and then redistributes it for the benefit of everyone else. So this meant that lands once owned by those on these islands was confiscated, the native population was exterminated, they were killed, and new colonial governments came in and were in charge. This colonization offered economic concessions to bring in new people back from the mother country to settle and colonize the now stolen lands, okay? In Venice, Venetian colonization was controlled by the city's rulers, and it was concentrated in the Eastern Mediterranean. Venetian colonies focused economically on the spice and silk trade. And then whereas Venice was an Eastern colony, Genoa was a Western one. Their economy depended on trade in sugar and sweet wines from the west coast of Africa. This trend in colonization moved even further west when European maritime merchants divided the Mediterranean from the North Sea. Italian merchants sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar north to the North Sea around 1270, and this began an expansion pattern of commerce and colonization in the Atlantic as opposed to the overland trade in the east on the Silk Road. And the Portuguese weren't the only ones to travel west. The Vikings, I'm sure you've heard of the Vikings. The Vikings actually reached Greenland and even Newfoundland in the year 1000, and it appears they settled there or at least traded there with natives up until the 14th century. So Christopher Columbus was not, of course, the first European to discover the New World. We will get back to the Mongols, I promise. But we need to move now to talking about, this is kind of going to turn into almost like a soap opera in terms of what goes down next. We're going to jump over to the Roman Catholic Church and specifically the Pope. So you'll recall from last class that oftentimes there were a lot of conflicts between the Pope, who was the head of the Roman Catholic Church, who lived in Rome, Italy, and the kings and queens of Europe, okay? They were constantly kind of vying for power. Who had more power, the Pope or the kings? And it really depended on the time period we're talking about. Well, technically you could, it depends on how far you want to go back. If you were to look at the time, even in early history, you could make a claim that there really were no Native Americans at all, that everyone who ended up settling there, were foreigners at one point. But yeah, I mean, it depends on the sources you look at. I've heard accounts of that. I've heard accounts of even Africans making it over even quite before the Vikings. So for sure, Europeans were not the first, like history textbooks are going to claim. But okay, so let's see here. Okay, so a weakening of the Pope's power and a growth in popular piety grew during this period, meaning people growing in their personal moral beliefs. Although Pope Innocent III marked the highest point of papal power, he was the strongest pope, he sowed the seeds of defeat. Pope Innocent III used the Crusades to expand his secular power, his control over those monarchs of Europe, those kings and queens. He even had wealth and political support equal to a king or a queen. He turned the church into a commercial powerhouse not to be reckoned with. He levied taxes, he enforced an income tax, and decreed the Pope as responsible for being able to forgive certain sins. So this is claiming a lot of both secular and spiritual authority over the people. Popes after him continued the practice of trying to centralize their power over the church, but they became involved in struggles that comprised the papacy. For example, popes conflicted with the Kingdom of Sicily and called for a crusade against Emperor Frederick II. So the Crusades weren't just Christian Europe versus Muslim Middle East. They were oftentimes, there was infighting there as well. Pope Martin IV, another pope, he launched a crusade against Peter III, the King of Aragon, which led to the death of Philip III of France. In his place rose Philip IV, his son, who was determined to punish the Pope for the death of his father. So King Philip IV of France is who we're going to zone in on for a few minutes here. He became known as Philip the Fair or Philip the Iron King, depending on your perspective. Can you guys still see and hear me okay? Awesome. Okay. So King Philip IV of France not only decided to hurt the Pope, he decided to destroy an elite group of Christian warriors and fighting monks known as the Knights Templar. I want you to keep them in your mind as I tell this story, okay? The Knights Templar. Again, an elite group of Christian warriors and fighting monks. At dawn on Friday, October the 13th, 1307, and by the way, some historians think this is the true origin of the superstition behind the unlucky day, Friday the 13th. Have you guys heard of that superstition? I'm sure you have. Of Friday the 13th? No, you haven't? Okay, so hearkening all the way back to this point in European history, some believe even today that Friday the 13th, if no matter what month it is, that if Friday falls on the 13th day of the month, that it's an unlucky day. Okay, that's what some people believe. All right, so anyway, on Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip the Fourth of France mandated that every Templar in his kingdom was to be arrested. Okay, so that Knights Templar, that group I told you about. A warrant accused the Templars of crimes ranging from heresy being that you're saying things that go against what the church teaches. So he basically was saying all the Templars in my kingdom of France have committed heresy, witchcraft, treason, and other perverse sins. It was estimated the order included 7,000 knights, sergeants, brothers, and priests. Also, the order controlled 800, this is the big thing. Listen carefully to this. The Knights Templar in France controlled 870 castles, precipitories, and houses. Okay, and they were armed and politically independent of the king. Not only could a king not order them to fight on his behalf, but they were exempt from royal taxes and tolls. Now think about this for a minute. Okay, Philip IV already hates the Pope. Okay, he thinks the Pope killed his dad, so he's out to get the Pope. And now there's this whole group of people in his kingdom who basically can do what they want and don't have to obey the king much at all. The Knights Templars, who I'm referring to. Okay, no wonder he's out to get them. Okay, so the whole of Europe, at the same time as the beginning of this issue, all of Europe was suffering from an economic downfall after the years of unsuccessful crusades. The destruction of the Knights Templar impacted Europe's monarchs and the church both politically and economically. The balance of power shifted somewhat towards European states as never before, and the authorities that existed still heeded papal requests. The event of the Templar controversy may seem small in comparison to other events in Europe, but its impact endured. Only 39 years after the end of the Templar Order, we see the emergence of the Black Death, and that's, of course, going to have a huge negative impact on Europe. But the big question here is, why did Philip IV target the Templars? Before Philip's political attempt to destroy the Knights Templar and regain some semblance of power over the Pope, a serious slap in his monarchical face occurred. In 1302, the Pope became a serious threat to Philip's power when Pope Boniface VIII said, "We declare, state, define, and pronounce that it's altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff." Basically, the Pope was saying, every human has to obey what the Pope says. Now, if you're a king living within the spiritual jurisdiction of the Pope, you're not going to like that, especially someone like Philip IV of France. He hated that. So anyway, he basically ordered an inquisition against all of the Templars and ordered them to be tortured. Okay. In the meantime, the Templars, the Knights Templar who were living in France, reached out to the Pope like, hey, a little help here. We're about to be tortured. And Pope Clement issued a decree and took advantage of the opportunity to transfer state control over religious and military orders to church control. But he still found the Templars guilty of Philip's charges. So it was the beginning of the end for the Knights Templar. All right, I'm going to move on. There's more to be said about this whole case study with the Knights Templar that's really, really interesting. If I had more time, I would keep going, but I want to move on briefly to our next topic, which is, let me move us here, the Black Death. Okay. You guys good so far? Let me move us here real quick. Okay, so briefly, let's talk about the Black Death. Oh, cool. That's cool, Michael. Most of the time, my students haven't done a lot of reading on the Knights Templar, so that's really cool that you that you've done a little bit of reading about them. Okay, so real quick, the Black Plague. Let's talk about it. So, while Philip was dealing with the power struggle between the monarchs, the knights, the Pope, commercial caravans from the east continued to use old land routes to trade silk and spices with the west. But that wasn't all they traded. Along with their caravans came rats, and lots of them. That's why I have a rat on the slide here. Before and during Philip's reign, population booms in Europe offered the continent powerful influences in global and military and economic matters. But with the introduction of the Black Death or Black Plague, feudal Europe is going to change forever. Oh yes, Da Vinci Code. I'm sure you guys have seen the movie or heard of it. Yeah, I actually wrote a whole paper, my senior thesis in college, about the Da Vinci Code. So I'm very familiar with it. Yeah. Okay, so real quick, when you think of the spread of the Black Plague, that what I want you to think about is those rats that were on the merchant ships. So it wasn't even just the rats, it was the fleas on the rats that was carrying Yersinia pestis, which was what spread the plague, okay? So, so overpopulation forced the European economy to remain subsistent, and therefore feudalism is going to succeed and might have even endured indefinitely had it not been for the Black Death. The tragedy of the Black Death would make Philip IV's entire crusade against the Knights Templar seem like pathetic in comparison. Any new strides made towards states' rights or the Pope's power became a moot point once the plague hit. The plague not only greatly affected the economies of Europe, but was in fact a direct result of the economic situation in the first place because of trade. The trade routes is really what spread it, okay? So the two reasons it spread, as you can see on the slide here, included, sorry, I just got rid of the chat pad, included the black rats whose fleas carried the plague and spread throughout the European continent, and then the network of shipping that connected them, the networks of trade that connected the Mediterranean with Northern Europe, and obviously the Mediterranean with the Middle East, with the Indian Ocean world, and the Silk Road caravan routes across Eurasia. All of that is going to be what carries the Black Plague. So the Black Plague in terms of Europe is going to be from roughly 1346 to 1350. High mortality rates are going to be caused by the plague will lead to more than just psychological shock, but a serious breakdown in trade, of culture, communications, foreign goods. And we see a tragic depopulation of Europe which virtually eliminates high-skilled workers like farm managers and academic leaders and teachers, even church clergy. Yeah, it created a shortage in manpower, which directly affected agrarian economics. Well, yeah, does anyone have a rough idea as to how many people have died across the globe of COVID? Anyone have an idea? I think 2 million so far is what I heard. Yeah, you can Google it and tell me if you see anything else, but about 2 million people have died from what I last heard. Uh, and I haven't fact checked that. It was just one of the news sources I happened to be looking at. Does anyone know how many people died of the Black Plague by the time it was done worldwide? $25 million people died worldwide of the Black Plague. This is later in history, obviously, but the other one that I teach is the Spanish flu. Anyone have a guess as to how many people died worldwide of the Spanish flu in 1919? Yep, 50 million. So just to put this into perspective, Black Plague again is, sorry, I just lost my PowerPoint here. Black Plague is 1346 to 1350, at least in Europe. Obviously, it was earlier in Asia and in other parts of the globe. But, roughly 30 million, 2 million have died roughly from COVID so far globally, and 50 million likely died from Spanish flu. Yeah, interesting. How am I doing on time? I think I'm just about out of time. So I've got through most of my bits here that I wanted to get through on the Black Plague. Unfortunately, the last thing I'll say is, unfortunately, human nature at its worst, many blamed the Jews for the spread of the Black Plague, which obviously was completely wrong. But because of that, there was a kind of a Holocaust, a very tragic Holocaust against the Jews as a result, which was very, very sad. And there are some interesting economic effects of the Black Plague. Obviously, the immediate thing is a lot of people are dying, and that's an issue that kind of stops everything in its tracks in terms of trade and the economy. But eventually, the people who did survive earned higher wages and were given the privilege to set their own schedules. Wages increased, people earned more money, and that meant a higher standard of living, at least for the survivors, right? There was a drop in prices for everything from food to horses to furs, which allowed feudal peasants and serfs who once were incredibly poor and couldn't afford much at all and just were, just making it from month to month. Now they had a little bit more money to spend, and they could have nicer clothes, or they could have another pair of clothes and whatnot, and have a little bit more of a variety of food to eat. So there was a little bit of silver lining to the Black Plague. Slide 21? Yeah, here's slide 21 here. Yeah, this is an interesting quote down here at the bottom by Boccaccio about the plague. He says about the Black Death, "How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk, and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world," meaning that's how quickly people died of the plague. And yeah, this is not the Holocaust from World War II, but unfortunately, there have been many different times throughout world history where the Jews have been persecuted. And this is one of those times in European history when Jews were persecuted. They were blamed for the spread of the plague, even though obviously they had nothing to do with the spread of the plague. But yeah, great question. And then finally, the theme of this period, I'm going to end here. The theme of this period was the ongoing struggle between the secular powers, like the kings of Europe, and spiritual matters, as in no other point in European history. This constant tension between the popes in Rome, claiming religious and secular authority at times over those kings of Europe, and the kings and queens oftentimes pushing back against the Pope for those throughout those times in European history when they sought to do that. Okay, so I hope I've left enough time for questions. How many of you would say you favorite topic that I covered tonight? What was your favorite topic that I covered? Let me start there. Yeah, how so, Mark? Trade, Black Death. Not that I like death and destruction by any means, but seeing how people react to pandemics, it's interesting. It doesn't always change from time, time period to time period. I mean, the pandemic that hit that we know, COVID-19, a lot of times we see similar reactions. So, at the time in Europe when the Black Death spread, the biggest thing people wanted to do, believe it or not, is leave their town. They wanted to travel somewhere else. They just wanted to leave it all behind. But what did they do when they left, when they went from one village to the next village or one city to the next city? What did they do? They spread. Yeah. And that's the same reaction that humans have today when pandemics start. They want to leave, they want to go somewhere else. Unfortunately, that means it spreads. Okay. So it's interesting. It might not be the 1300s, but even in 2020, 2021, and people have the same kind of knee-jerk human reactions. I just want to leave. I want to go somewhere else. But then it causes the spread. Yeah. All right. I think that's it for tonight. Thank you guys so much for your time. You guys were an awesome class. And I hope to see you in my next webinar. I look forward to seeing you guys then.